Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about database emulators and mocks. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, would you say that database emulators are to prefer over mocks in unit testing? I would say that either or. I don't think that these are mutually exclusive. The thing that I usually say is that I would prefer, unless, I mean, there are absolutely database emulators that are basically the real thing that you can use. In as much as humanly possible, though, I try to separate database connections and mocking a little bit here because I would argue, and this is just me arguing, that connecting to a database in a unit test by definition makes it an integration test because you are quote unquote integrating to another system. Your code is connecting to an external service of some sort. And that means that it's slightly different from the sort of test I do with unit testing. So what I usually like to do is that I have two testing strategies for making sure that all the code and so forth and like all of this is sort of working. And that is that I try to, like my repository classes, my database access objects model, call it whatever language you have, the entity you have in your program that represents your connection to a database. That entity, what I usually do is that I write some tests for the serialization of data. So in other words, I make sure that I can send the right fields to the database, get them, list them, like these basic things on those sort of model objects that just represents the connection, right? The raw data queries and things like that. Because once I do that, and I do that without any emulators if possible. Like if I am 100% sure, because there are like I think it's MongoDB and like similar sorts of, they have in-memory versions that basically all the same. Like that's not going to be a difference here. Then I write some tests for that, and I'd run those against the actual database. And I do that because I have absolutely no reason not to do it, in my opinion, at the very least, because this is an integration test. And so why I do it that way is because I don't really see, like for me, if you have done the measurements, if you have a fresh database, like completely clean and so forth, I mean, you're not going to save any meaningful amount of of execution speed by running like a mock class that has like a list, like a memory array or something. I've worked with guys like that who's like, this is one of the few times I really felt that my CTO at that company, he really understood how to talk to this person, because I was just so tired. So this guy, he was talking about, oh, we need to make sure that every unit test runs as quickly as possible, and that's why we need to keep it in memory. And so my CTO says, okay, cool, let's do a benchmark. Let's compare your solution to running in the database. And when we looked at it, we're talking about it's a few microseconds of the difference when you basically run like an instance in a container or something like that together with your, like now we have even test containers and stuff like that. And so he very empirically proved to this developer that your optimization is ridiculous. It's like it doesn't do anything. It's actually, and that's why I do it this way. I argue it's better. It's better to not mock in the situation where you're actually interested in knowing what went to the database and that you get the right thing out. There's no reason to mock that because it's like it's the closest thing to reality that you can get without a lot of extra cost. The mocking, on the other hand, happens for me, or that's when you get a little bit higher than that. So an example would be, what I usually mock is when I have a function or something that's going to execute some business logic. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have a database query in there and it's going to connect to an external database or something like that. Now, if it's just my own logic and there's no reason for me to mock that thing, then I'll just let it go to the database, because as I said, like the connection, the cost is almost nothing. However, let's say that I have to simulate an error. Well, then mocking is pretty useful. It's one of my favorite reasons to use mocking. I try to be careful with my mocking, because if you go too wild with mocking, you end up stubbing off stuff that is like, you're basically testing your own mock. Like I see this all the time, where people mock off so much that the logic that you're supposed to be testing isn't being tested anymore. You're testing the mock, and mock isn't any logic in it. So what I try to think in terms of is, when I have an error, Well, I have to simulate that somehow, and that's where mock becomes super useful, because now I can create simulate an error, and see that my code can handle it. The general guideline I try to follow when I think about mocking versus not mocking is, if you imagine a function, and in that function you have things that are just closed into the scope of the body of the function, and then you might have other services, other methods, other functions that are part of live somewhere else in the system. Now, those functions, those abstractions, I'm not interested in testing those abstractions in the scope of my function, because those functions should be tested somewhere else. Like, they should have already been tested. So if they have a very specific behavior and I need to make sure that they behave in a certain way to test the logic that is in my function, that's when I mock. Because I don't want to have, because as you can imagine, guys, if you have functions that are used in another function and that is as part of another function, the layers just keep on adding, and if you have to make sure that the call tree of all those functions is tested at every single step, every single time you use it in another function, it becomes really difficult for you, because now you have to really do some gymnastics to create the state that you want of the data, so that you can get that simulated situation, as I said. And that's what mocking, I argue, should be about. It should be about trying to create a expected behavior from something that is outside of the scope of what you're trying to test. So again, if you think about your own function, the logic that you are doing in your function, that's the thing that you're trying to test usually when you're writing a unit test for that thing. And so if you are depending on external systems or something where there's a bunch of logic that makes it very complicated for you to just focus your test on the thing that you are doing, that's when you mock. You try to just stub off and remove the stuff that makes it complicated for you to test the logic that you care about, and then you write a test for somewhere else. Like in my example with the database, if I know that I have some tests that checks that saving to the database with the right data structure and the validation and all that stuff that I might have in place in order to connect to a database and so forth, well, I could mock it if I really, really wanted to, but I could also just let it go to the database without having to think about it. I do both sometimes. As I said, sometimes I do it with an error, and sometimes I just don't care about it, because when it comes to specifically a database, it's pretty straightforward as long as you clear the database between runs. But as I said, let's say you have a third-party integration to an API, or you have another function that does something really complicated that really behaves weirdly if you don't really give it specific information, and you don't want to care about all of that in your test and do that work. That's a perfect situation to stub it off, because it doesn't matter that that function should already be tested, and you're not really caring about testing that function now. You're testing the logic that is in your part of the thing, and you're just depending on it. It's in a similar way. I said that actually today to a coworker of mine who said, how should we think about testing if we have a lot of libraries? And I say, well, if you have a reason to doubt a library, you might have to write some tests for specific situations. But on average, if you are depending on somebody else's library or an external dependency, it's usually bad practice to try to retest their code. So if you're using other libraries and you're testing their code, it's going to be really hard for you to maintain that. Because usually these libraries might be bigger than you might imagine. And so you have to quote-unquote trust a little bit that abstraction that you are depending on has already been checked and cleared and tested by the people who are owning that abstraction. So what I want you to take away from this is that I usually say that you can use emulators. I usually don't bother with them unless it's, as I said, it's really easy, because using the real database is super, super easy as well, in my opinion, at the very least. There are test containers is one of my favorite ones, where I used to have pipelines and builds and stuff like that. You can do that, where you just run them like a local database on your machine or in a Docker container or something like that, and you connect and you just run everything. And in a pipeline, you do the same thing, right? You run a Docker Compose or something like that, and you just kind of go with it. So, and then you clear the database between each test run. That's my favorite way of doing it, because, as I said, time-wise, it takes almost no time whatsoever. It might be different if I have to do, as I said, you have specific situations. Maybe you have to seed the database. There are all these situations where it might not be so cost effective to run the real database. Then you might do some mocking or stubbing or things like that. But those are specific cases. On average, I use the real database because it is I mean, that's the closest thing you're going to get to a production environment, basically, when you're testing your code. And the time I mock is usually either when I have to simulate an error or something very specific has to happen. As I said, if it's really difficult for me to get the right behavior that I need from, say, like an external abstraction, like another system or something like that, and I can't just do the real live calls and still have it be fairly cheap for me to implement the test for my code, that's when I mock. So errors, or if you have to simulate specific, like let's say you have an API and you have different types of response codes or the different types of responses that you need to deal with in your unit test, that's a perfect situation to mock, because now you can perfectly control what you're going, like the response you're going to get from that function or that network client or whatever you're using in order to connect to an external system. So general rule, use databases, write tests for your data models that like do the data access repository classes, DAOs or whatever, so that you know that the serialization and deserialization is working and all the validation is working. And then once you've done that, it's sort of up to you if you want to use the real database or if you want to mock, because you know that you have done the testing of that abstraction. That rule applies for everything, in my opinion. If you're depending on a service or a class or a function that is somewhere else in your code in the test that you are writing, then it's not the thing that you're trying to test, mock it or stub it. Because as long as there's a test testing that it is doing its thing correctly, then you shouldn't have to retest it every time you reuse it somewhere else. Have a great day.